School and is helping put together this series on, what do we call it, energy in general?
Science, technology, and engineering.
Okay, so it's even more encompassing. But Varun, I think, is in this semester the first speaker in that series. We met when you were at Stanford, right?
Yes.
A while back. But Varun is now at UT Austin, where he studies. What I like about his work is that he pays attention both to the underlying technologies and to the politics. So a lot of getting new technologies implemented, as you know, is getting the politics right or being creative about the political constraints. And the marriage between the two is an area of his focus. So he's steeped in both sides, and it's nice to have you here and situate this particular work in India's energy system in general, but also in your broader work. And Laura is going to discuss the work and comment on it. And Laura just told me she taught her first class.
My
Her first core class.
core class at the Kennedy School.
Yes. What is the class on?
Some policy analysis.
Policy analysis. So perfect. So we shall policy analyze Varun. So why don't you start?
Sure. Well, what I'm going to do is just straddle along, and this is a very small group, so this should be very conversational. Yeah. So first of all, I really would like to thank Tarun, the South Asia Institute, and all of you for inviting me and having me here. I'm really excited. This is my third talk, actually, in different forums at Harvard, and every time I come here, I really enjoy it. I did spend, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, I did spend a exchange semester at MIT, and so I've spent some time in this area also as a graduate student. So every time I get the opportunity, I really am very excited to come here. So what I'm going to do today is basically share with you the first. So we have about an hour and a half for this session, and much of it, or at least half of it, is expected to be devoted to discussion and broader question and answer and so on. But I want to take the first 40 minutes or so to set the stage, basically. Many of you have some idea at different levels of what the Indian energy system is about. I know Rohit and also Nick they're actually working on the energy, Indian system, so they know quite a bit. But then, so that just to facilitate the discussion, I want to set some common stage, basically. And the first few slides, I will talk very generally about what the state of the Indian energy system is in very broad brush terms. And then maybe 20 minutes or so, I'll take a somewhat of a deep dive into some basic facts and descriptive statistics and the state of the oil and gas sector. Much of this work is actually what I did at Stanford between 2008 and 2010. So basically 3 years or so. I haven't done much active research in this area the last year or so, but it has not changed. And my effort will be to talk about long-term drivers of what has brought the Indian energy system to where it is and where it might actually go. So basically, in my initial remarks, try to talk about background material and just present some descriptive facts and my observations through my own research, and then leave much of the substantive discussion, hopefully, for the second half of it. So this is different. It's not a research paper, but it's kind of collection of my own observations coming out of my different pieces of work. More generally, I work on innovation diffusion of energy technologies in the broad brush sense of it. And this is very India-specific, as the mandate of the talk is. So this is a very simple high-level chart that shows in 2011 what the energy mix, consumption mix of India is. Much of what you see is actually coal, about 43%, 23% oil and gas, and a lot of solid waste, and biomass, some nuclear, and some renewables. There are two important things here. The same thing for the US is almost equally divided between coal, gas, and oil. But from India's perspective, two important things here. One is the 41% coal, that much of that is actually domestically produced. About 85 to 90% is domestically produced. That's very important. That's for several reasons, but most important being that India's fossil fuel reserves, most of them are actually coal reserves. So 80% of India's reserves are coal reserves. So that's where most of the production and consumption also comes into play. It's very interesting. Rohit is actually taking a deep dive in this, but that dynamic of domestic production is actually shifting very rapidly. And so it's really getting bottlenecked, and there are huge implications of what's happening in the coal sector. So that's coal. On oil, it's only 23%, but most of it, 80% of it, is actually imported. That's very important because especially the last 7 years or so, oil prices have been historically at very high levels, and that has huge implications for India's foreign reserves and foreign exchange and so on. It's really been throughout India's post-independence history since 1947, the forex implications of oil imports have really kind of been the overarching theme of both the actions of the government, of the largest oil and gas companies, and also the recent policy and regulatory changes in India. So those are basically the two important things from this slide. Now, if you look to the future, there are all sorts of projections, and this is one from IEA. There are similar projections from also different agencies within India. But basically, if you look at those two columns, 2005 and 2030, you see roughly on all counts, coal, oil, or gas, the projected increases are about threefolds, roughly. Or if you're looking at 2015, which is closer to today, it's roughly doubling of all of these different fuel uses between now and 2030. On an annualized terms, it's anywhere between 4 to 5% annual growth in each of these. And that's assuming a moderate growth scenario. Just so basically 4 to 5% growth assumptions in these models. I have a slide later on that talks about the same thing from India's perspective, where most of the planning has happened or happens using 8 to 10% growth scenarios, in which case these numbers are even more aggressive, actually. So this is the context. This is where the projections and expectations and requirements basically are. And this is kind of the reality of domestic production and import. So basically, what you have plotted on the x-axis is the import dependency for these three fuel types, and the different colors. So the blue is basically what it was in 2005, what the import dependency, how much of each of these fuels were being imported. And the red and green are basically projections, optimistic and pessimistic, out to 2030. What you see is certainly for oil, it's import dependency is 75% now. It's projected to grow to 85, 90%. For natural gas, it is actually not. Natural gas is kind of a wild card in India. There's just so many moving parts. The regulation is in very, very early stages. The production is in early stages. It's very complex, and so that's why you don't even see an optimistic scenario there. But in coal, that's as I was saying earlier, it can swing any whichever way depending on what happens with Coal India Limited, which is a major coal producer in India. And we can get into that, but coal, my remarks are not as much focused on coal. Nonetheless, I do want to make the point that really what happens in coal has huge implications, not just for the broad electricity sector, certainly, but then also what happens to energy in India broadly, and also to industrial organization of energy in India. And with all of that, again, this is a reference scenario. A key theme that keeps coming back is the question of energy and development. And this is, again, one of the projections from the World Energy Outlook, which, even after all this growth, in India, you will be left with about 450 million people without access to electricity. So this is electricity focused, and that's partly because of population growth, but also a key reason for that is bottlenecked infrastructure investments and lagging regulatory oversight and so on. So there are several factors that go into it. Nonetheless, this is a very humbling picture. Right? So that's kind of the context of what is needed, and still what might the challenges remain even after all these growth scenarios are actually met. From the policy making perspective and from the policy circles, this is kind of the vision. This is a uniformly accepted statement across political parties across administrators in the public and so on, which is the vision of 8 to 10% growth at affordable cost. Now, the affordable cost piece is actually common to energy policy of almost every country. What sets this apart is basically the 8 to 10% growth for about 2 decades. And that brings a whole bunch of different challenges, which some of which I'm going to get into a little bit more. Right? Now, I mentioned 10% of the coal is being imported, but even that, I mean, one of the misconceptions is coal, or India and China are the Saudi Arabia and Kuwait or Abu Dhabi of coal, but that's not true, certainly for India. China has a lot more reserves than India has, but India, if you take the utilization projected at 2030, reserves will be exhausted in 40 to 50 years, and that's very scary, given much of the build out is actually coal in India. So that has a whole life of its own, but then it also has all these bottlenecks have huge economic impact. So this one estimate in 2007 put the economic losses, GDP losses, at 6% because of inefficiencies and energy shortages in India. And this all is happening within the broader political economy of how people have been attuned to different types of energy prices and different types of subsidies across different sectors. But there was a major blackout just a year and a half ago, and then every time there's price increase, there is a lot of political backlash. But between the sentences, you get a sense, and I'll discuss in more details, that there is still a lot of proactive management of prices. There's a lot of controls that is happening, despite some major policy changes that have happened. So that's the state of the system. Now, my main observations, if I were to just summarize the 6 main things that have, in my observation, are kind of the underpinning theme of much of what is happening in the energy sector in India, but certainly in oil and gas, those are that what we see in terms of current state and the ability of the Indian energy system to move forward to take on some of those challenges and projections in demand growth. Basically, 2 types of path dependencies are actually, they set the boundary condition. They're actually very important to understand before really getting into understanding the implications and where the system can go. One is the politics of subsidies. So about 3 decades ago, late 70s and early 80s, about the time when agricultural productivity was starting to grow, there was this green revolution, so-called green revolution, that happened in India. Around that time, politicians figured out that offering electricity as a free benefit can attract votes. So that's, it's simple to trace it back to about then, but since then it has really become very institutionalized, systematized, and folks expect it. So it's a big part. So that started with electricity, but in recent years, for a variety of very complex reasons, not always obvious, this has also become a major piece in the oil sector. So subsidies and how the state interacts with the broader public on expectations of energy prices and what it means for daily livelihood. So that's important to understand. And the second piece is really the choice of organizing the energy sector in India through state-owned companies. And there are basically, just to give you some sense, there are 2 primary reasons for why that happened historically. So post-independence, there was a socialist bent within the government in India, and much of production throughout the economy, actually, in India was organized through government production, but certainly even more so in the energy sector and for minerals and so on. So just the state and bent of the government itself was very key. And the second piece, especially relevant to oil and gas sector, was the fear and suspicion of outsiders and outside companies, basically, and some of which actually had some truth to it, especially because there was increasing evidence in the 50s and 60s of price discrimination and all sorts of very interesting tactics being used by the international oil companies. So all these factors combined to really convince the Indian government to organize broad parts of the energy sector, but especially oil and gas, within the state-owned, through state-owned companies. And that has huge implications. I have some more slides actually going into details of that. But then that, again, sets the stage and the boundary conditions of what changes and at what rate can you expect certain changes, because both these factors have been established and institutionalized in the broader political economy for the last 5 decades or so. So any changes you make have to happen within that context, and actually either within that context or you have to create a whole new system. And part of what is happening is also parallel systems of organizing the energy industry. So I'll get into some more of that. The second piece is one of the very important things that has somewhat disciplined the different aspects of energy organization and subsidies and so on, and put some brakes on the wild dreams that politicians might have had in terms of how much they can offer for free, is really the fiscal pressures. And there are two here, both domestically inflation measures, but then also more importantly for the oil and gas sector in India is foreign exchange. India, when it's, for the first 3-4 decades, it's almost a closed economy, not much of imports. It was really designed as a closed economy in many ways. That's an extreme term to use, but broadly, there's not much interaction happening, and the idea was, homegrown technology and so on. So not much import or export was happening there then, and so the question, and oil still was being imported quite a bit. So throughout the last 6 decades, actually, India foreign exchange and oil imports have formed a huge percentage of the foreign exchange that India has had to cough out. And that has constantly, to the extent, I think that is the single most important factor of all sorts of disciplines and changes and regulation and policy that have happened throughout the history. So that's been very important. I have some more data and details on that part. At present, starting late 90s and the early 2000s, I do believe that major, very important policy and regulatory framework and pieces have been put together. That's extraordinary, and that's very important. Has it changed the scenario? Are things dramatically different? No. But on the list of things to do, you would still have the right policy framework and the right regulatory framework requirements, and those, I believe, are actually in place. It's a question of implementation, and there are huge hurdles there, but without these in place, we would not be talking about implementation hurdles. We would still be at the stage of, let's get the policy framework right. I believe that the major pieces are actually in place, and I'll show you that it has been a mixed experience, even just within the last 6-7 years, but there are some very good, very useful and positive directions that have been taken. In terms of the industrial organization of it, in the last 15 years or so, the role of dual firms have actually been really, it has increased quite a bit. And dual firms are firms that are serious corporate folks. They have serious corporate governance. They care about profits. They like functioning like normal businesses, but then they also have deep ties to the government. So they understand the broader political economy, and they can make the different pieces work. In my observation, in India, it is actually going to the next level, which is, and that's why I have this phrase that it's not formal, but I'm loosely put. My idea is these firms are actually transforming to dual integrated firms. So there are still broad policy and regulatory risks associated with the broader system, not in specific sectors where, especially in oil and gas, some of the policy and regulation is actually fairly robust. But broadly, if you talk about coal, electricity, import-export policy, foreign exchange, currency policy, tax policy in India, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. And to manage all of that seems like firms that are not only dual in nature, but then also that are very integrated in different parts of the energy system. So they not only focus on oil and gas, but they also have businesses in coal and electricity. And there are some firms like the Tatas and the Reliances, which are the typical dual firms, but then they're actually even more than that in my own observation. And that's been very critical for them to be able to manage the existing risks, which are still quite substantial, actually, looking at from the firm's perspective. Lack of accountability and transparency. I mean, this is the extreme way to put this is basically administrative malfunction, misfunction, or corruption in the other extreme. And this again goes back to how the entire administrative system is set up. Much of this is through ex-ante monitoring rules and very little post-performance or ex-post incentives, basically, or performance-based incentives. And that has had huge impacts in the past, but that exact theme continues to actually be a bottleneck. Again, there are, especially in the last 5 years or so, some very interesting and useful positive directions taken there, but it continues to be one of the issues. And on the question of technology, my observation is that given the scale of growth and demand for the last 10 years and projected for the next 20, 30 years in India, India has not benefited from that in increasing and developing its technological capacity. So it's basically all the way from absorbing technologies from foreign countries or MNCs to the other extreme of actually being a serious innovator at home and bringing those technologies overseas. And there are some very good examples of individual firms that have done that successfully. But I believe those are one-off examples. Those are not systematic guide to what is happening in the broader energy system in India. Right, so those are my broad observations, and the next few slides are actually showing you some descriptive data and trying to give some more insights in what goes into making these observations. But before I do that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, we're following, or if there are any clarification questions at this point.
Those projections on the earlier slides, everything going up by 4%, 8%, those obviously have some underlying model associated with them, right? Do you have any comments on how sensible that model is, or what?
I think this of all models is, this assumes a 4 to 5% rate of economic growth. And once you make that assumption, it kind of trickles down to what parts of the economy are growing, and then you get down further as to how much energy each of those sectors actually uses. So in some ways, this is one of the more conservative models. If you see models coming out of the Indian, so this is from IEA, which assumes a 4 to 5% GDP growth. But
there are some assumptions about relative prices of the different approaches also, right, that underlie this. I'm just surprised at gas being so tiny, for instance.
Right, and that's because so the gas story in Asia is actually very different than it is in the US, right? And still the LNG prices that are being imported are actually very, very high. So all of that actually, I think this certainly is based on the assumption that gas prices internationally will remain high. Because much of, I think this uses all the gas that is being used, much of that is actually being imported through LNG in India. And that's my understanding of what's happening in this model. Nora?
On that, I understand that they're exploring methane hydrates and things like that. Do they, and the IEA sometimes does scenarios where they look at different prices. I think one of your questions was probably about, the cost of solar versus the cost of other,
Yeah, well, there's so many relative prices in there that drive it. So I'm just curious as to whether the assumptions are sort of standard assumptions that are made across the world, or they are contextualized to different circumstances?
I think they are actually, so there are common set of assumptions that are applied, but then also, it's not totally decoupled from the Indian energy system. Right. So the fact that you do see that gas is not a large part is actually somewhat representative, at least, of the recent past and the recent future. Nick.
There's also a paper by Catherine Wolfram and Paul Gertler and others at Berkeley about these projections and how they play out with different countries, and their main observation is that the IEA uses average incomes, but it really matters who is getting richer, the distribution of income, because energy use has a sort of non-linear shape over the income distribution, and certain people are much more likely to acquire cars, appliances, and so forth. And so their main finding is that for lower and middle income countries, they think that these projections vastly understate the likelihood.
And that would actually, I think that's actually very, it makes a lot of sense to me. And for the purpose of this discussion, I think that the fact that these are conservative figures is actually still, keeps us. That discussion on what goes in these models is actually, fundamentally very, very important, right? I mean, that's where a lot of the policymakers and everybody is actually paying attention to those numbers. But these, in my understanding, are actually fairly conservative. And even with these numbers, you still see major issues across the board. So I think if we really get into the structural and distributional issues, things get actually even more amplified. So, point actually very well taken on what goes in these models.
Just one other comment that I'm puzzled over, which I'm sure these people who build the projections have thought through and built into it. I mean, there has to be a general equilibrium closure of this argument, right? Which is that if you start with the growth projections of a country and you derive the demand for individual energy sources, and then you see that it's so unrealistic that it's going to break the bank, then it must mean the original demand forecast, the original growth projections will not hold, and therefore you're into this recursion that breaks down.
Yeah, I think the way, and Laura can comment on this also, the way they do it is through structural constraints on different parts of the economy, and how much each energy portion will contribute or not. So they would throw out models that tell them that India can go 100% nuclear. They would put additional constraints saying, okay, 15% nuclear. So there are actually way too many constraints and ad hoc assumptions that do go into building these models. Other questions on other parts of the thoughts so far? Nick?
Well, on the list of 6 important factors, the fourth was dual firms, or firms that are integrated with the government. It seemed your description of that point was rather positive, that there are these great risks and you need a firm that can sort of manage risks both at the sort of government level and at the market level, and these firms are a natural response to that. But an alternative is to describe it as regulatory capture and say that if large conglomerates are dictating policy, then it's going to be distorted well into the future, and there'll be implicit subsidies hidden all over the system. That's sort of a negative development, and that works in the current political economy.
Sure. So let me clarify. My description was positive in the sense of it was describing the outcome given the system. It was not the positive negative positive. It was the normative positive positive. So that is an outcome, and I do have a few slides that actually get to the point of. So the key point here is that a lot of these transitions in policy and regulation are actually happening at a time when growth is actually very fast and needs are very strong. And when that happens in a system where regulation and legal precedents and policy is actually not well set and clear, so basically the question of credibility of commitments, when that is not established, that provides an extremely unique opportunity for dual firms to come in and capture all sorts of benefits and basically lock in for the longer term. So I see it as a troubling development from the equity and distribution perspective of who is able to benefit from it. Nonetheless, the other side of the picture is the ability of the state or the government to actually coordinate or actually make happen the parts of the energy system that are actually happening without these players is even weaker, right? So the government is is fairly aware and actually playing a part into all this broader interaction. But then if they were to separate their hands right now, the situation would actually be probably worse, because the policy pieces, regulatory pieces, the regulators themselves, the regulatory norms, these are very, very evolving. I mean, the regulatory history in India for the energy system is 10 years old, literally. That's for a country of the size of India, for an energy system of the size of India, that's basically nothing. That's starting yesterday, right? So it's a positive, an outcome of what has happened, which has troubling implications actually. Okay, so let's get a little bit into some data and some other descriptive facts so that we can have some more discussion. A lot of what I'm going to actually say derives from a book chapter that I contributed to this edited volume, which came out last year from Cambridge University Press. It was edited by David Victor, Mark Thurber, and David Hults. It has 15 country case studies, all the major ones from the demand side. China and India were the main demand countries. All the other case studies in this were actually oil and gas producers. And it also had 5 cross-cutting case studies. So a lot of what I'm going to say is actually, it derives from this book chapter. So now let's take a deeper dive into the oil and gas sector. Total oil consumption in India is 4 million barrels per day. That's last year. And that compares to about 20 million barrels per day for the US. So about a fifth, about 20% of what we consume, about 4% of world consumption. Much of that is, 3/4 of that is actually imported. So that's the high oil import dependency for India, and much of that comes from the Middle East. I mentioned this before. The government has historically, and even today, is very central to how the sector is organized. So the government owns a lot of these companies that are engaged in all parts of the oil and gas sector. More recently, just the last 10 years or so, there has been systematic effort, with some success actually, in opening this up to private participation, both domestic and international firms. And I alluded to this also before, which is there have been major strides made in terms of policies and reforms, which I believe are in place now. Nonetheless, intervention in retail pricing, which is where really the politics comes face to face with, the politicians come face to face with the public. That retail price intervention on electricity, on oil, gas, kind of really makes this whole thing very, very complex. So. This is just oil and gas, which I think is actually, from an analysis perspective, is actually simpler. What is even more complicated is the electricity system, where the state level politics comes into play. That's I believe is exponentially more complicated. It also involves the coal sector and so on. So just the last 10 years or so, production in India. So the blue line here is the domestic production of oil. That's been flat. And we'll get into a little bit more as to why and how that happened, what implications it has had in the broader political economy of this sector. And obviously, the consumption has been growing, leading to increasing imports. Now, in terms of where the oil is coming from for India, said 3/4 of it is being imported. Most of it is coming from Saudi Arabia. This was from 2007, right? And if you look at what happened last year, much of it has not changed except this one sector, which is Iran. So there, the imports have actually declined, and that is representative of the international sanctions and so on that has been applied to Iran, but also the difficulty Iran has been having in actually producing more oil and gas for international supplies. And that has had very interesting geopolitical implications. Especially Iran and India have had historically a very strong ties. But more recently, just the last 5 years or so, India has actually supported many of these international sanctions on Iran, which would not have been possible if you still were in this scenario, actually. So that's interesting. The second piece here is that increasingly the national oil company in India, which is responsible for most of the production, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, ONGC, it has been forming ties with other national oil companies. And in this case, in Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, and some imports are actually increasing to come from these companies. So there's some interesting realignment with interesting geopolitical implications, which I'm not going to get into right now. So let's get a little bit deeper into looking at ONGC and the organization of the oil and gas sector, but specifically focus on ONGC. So these are the main domestic companies engaged in different parts of the oil and gas sector. It includes companies, so all of them except two, ONGC, which is here, and OIL. The rest are actually mostly refining companies. They have large refining operations. OIL is actually entirely exploration and production, so that's upstream, that's exploring for oil and then producing it. And ONGC, up until 10 years ago, was entirely exploration and production, but recently it also has refining operations. So you see a bit of vertical integration happening. An oddball here is number 2, Reliance Industries, which got into this business late 90s and actually is a very, very major player right now in refining. It has the largest refineries in the whole world. It also has substantial gas productions in India. So it made a bunch of discoveries in the early 2000s and produces a lot of gas. So, but then it's also deep into coal, a lot into electricity generation as well as distribution and so on. So it's a classic example of these dual integrated firms. But let's focus a little bit more on ONGC. So a couple things to keep in mind. 70% of ONGC is still owned by the government. So there has been some divestment of government shares over the last 15 years or so. And $30 billion is what the revenue was last year. Can somebody take a guess of what the profit was? So 30 billion in revenue, what could be the profit? For ONGC, yes. Any guess? I mean,
500 million. Are we guessing this?
500 million? Say again?
The sign or the amount?
Zero. Zero. Okay. So that's a good.
Higher, no? It would be higher because it's only in crew and
right.
exploration.
Right. So the interesting difference here is that there has been price rationalization in some parts of the oil and gas sector. The real controls and interventions are still at the extreme downstream, at the products level, when the product gets to the pump. That's where the product meets the politics. Right? Upstream, over the last 10 years or so, prices have actually been rationalized, and ONGC and other producers for that matter, Reliance and OIL, anybody who produces oil in India can get full market prices. There are still discrepancies at the margins. There's still government interventions, but largely you can say that it's much more rationalized. So the profits for ONGC last year were $5 billion post-tax. So that's after-tax profit. Right? That's unheard of, basically. And that has very important implications. So what I'm going to share in the next few slides is talk about the major policy changes and regulatory changes that have happened. But they have happened in the context of increasing profits, increasing revenues, and increasing financial ability and independence at ONGC itself. So there is regulatory and reform pressure, but then there is fiscal independence to do all sorts of things. So really it has been a very, very interesting development. Laura and...
Oh, yeah, so I thought those get sort of large proportion of that gets transferred back to the government through dividend payouts.
Even after that. So of the $5 billion, 1.5 or so will get paid out as dividends. 70% of which will go to the government because that's the share. 30% of it gets... Still, ONGC is still left with most of those profits. Because now, see, one of the interesting things that have happened, so 2004, ONGC got publicly listed in 2004. And since then, ONGC has used the public platform to say government is taking away all its money, which is basically public's money, which is in some senses true. So that puts a brake on how much the government can actually take away. And the question is, when you're left with that, so ONGC is a zero debt company. It has no debt. They used to have 10, 15% debt 10 years ago, 15 years ago. In the last decade, they have paid all of it. They are sitting on large cash reserves, which is actually only increasing as oil prices have increased and demand has increased, right? So the reform pressures on ONGC have been felt because of some policy reforms, but then the increasing cash reserves actually acts as a moderating factor on how much, if the reform asks you about efficiencies of drilling and production and so on, but most of that were discovered 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We are talking about marginal changes in efficiencies and marginal numbers, how many wells you have drilled and exploration and so on, which kind of completely get overshadowed in the billions of dollars you have. So if it's extremely difficult to separate the impact on efficiency of ONGC that have happened through some of these reforms. There are other indicators in terms of competition and technical benchmarks and so on that have happened that I'll get into. So positive impacts on efficiency and rationalizing some things, but then the cash reserves that ONGC has kind of moderated much of it. Laura, you had a question earlier.
It was actually going to be about how much of those profits are going to the government. Just like in Pemex in Mexico, basically all of it gets used and they're having a hard time. They've been trying for a decade to reform and try to allow them to make strategic investments and develop technological capabilities for the
Yeah, that used to be a problem 20 years ago, 10 years ago actually, not anymore. Government can take away only that much. So it taxes a lot. I have a slide. It taxes a lot. Even after that, you have $5 billion. You can take back 1.5 billion. If you go beyond that, there's all sorts of public ruckus and Financial Times, Economic Times, shareholders. They'll all start clamoring, and the first person to clamor will actually be the CEO on the public forum, saying, "Look, this is your money. Why are you allowing this to be taken away?" So it's been a very, and that's I think generally it's just been fortuitous that prices have increased so much and ONGC has had a production base, but generally the ability came through reforms in corporate governance, which is giving these companies more autonomy in terms of how those function. So I think fundamentally, it's based on the right principles. It's just been very fortuitous how this is all developed. Right?
You're actually saying that the ONGC is able to push back against the state despite the state being a 70% shareholder? Because a lot of the corporate government, a lot of the board is Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas officials, right?
Yes.
It's not like they're random independent directors. There are some.
There are some. Mm-hmm.
But despite that, ONGC is able to push back.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so this happens, and ONGC is one of the very few companies that has the Navaratna status, which is the gem of the gem company status, which means a lot more autonomy in terms of organizational and financial functioning, basically. And part of that is how much the government can actually intervene and who they appoint and so on. So certainly there is still influence on who gets appointed as the CEO on broad directions. But in terms of really functioning and using of that money, so of the $3.5 billion that left, that is left with ONGC, it has broad leverage and flexibility to use that. It has to. So I believe for every investment, especially overseas, that is made over $100 million or something in that ballpark, they do have to go to the ministry for clearance. But those are the one-off things and the big things where some interaction is involved. Even there, they have to depend on ONGC to be able to make some calls. So this is a classic principal agent problem, where still much of the information and increasingly the flexibility to operate still lies with the agent. Yes.
I wonder, can all the state-owned companies make profit? Yeah.
Or do all of them?
Yeah.
Well, that's the answer is actually yes. All of them do make profits. Now, let me get to a different slide where I think it's a very complex question because it seems like there should be a very simple answer. So the simple answer is yes. The way that all of them are profitable is through a lot of financial magic that the government actually does. So it taxes everybody quite high, right? So if normally if you tax at 15%, if the price would be $3 per gallon, the taxes are so high in India, the prices are actually $5 or $6. And then they take prices off. So let me get to that point. But the answer is yes, through a lot of very interesting and complex financial engineering. So let's take a deeper look at ONGC. So the next 3 slides are actually chronological history of how ONGC developed and evolved and what some of the pressures were. But you can almost see, I think, this chart which shows production, and that is the black portion here. And then the top curve is actually the consumption or the demand, the production being flat, actually increasing in the late 70s and the 80s, and then flat more recently. I think the broader development of policy and regulation in India in the oil and gas sector follows very closely what has happened to this demand imports gap, actually. So early on, as I said, the socialist bent and suspicion of outsiders led to state organization or state-led organization of this sector. But the years between the 70s and the 80s were kind of the golden years for ONGC. And that happened for 2 reasons. One is there was some easy oil. And so Indian geology is actually very complex and not necessarily known for having a lot of resources. So there are decent amount of resources, but it's not Brazil. It's not the North Sea, right? So there has always been some suspicion. Nonetheless, ONGC continued some exploration, but then through help from Russians, that's where a lot of this activity actually started. So Russia helped ONGC in the late 60s, early 70s in their exploration work, and the major fields, the Mumbai high fields, were actually discovered in 75 with help from Russia, and there was a lot of technology transfer that happened, a lot of equipment that Russia brought in. Before that, the 20 years before that, where India was trying to engage and work with different international oil companies, that was not very successful. And so coming in of the Russians provided kind of the breakthrough that ONGC was looking for. It is also very interesting that during these years, so Indira Gandhi was the president. She was, let's not go there. But I think the main point I'm trying to make there is foreign exchange was a key pressure item in the late 70s, early 80s, and oil was a big drain on those resources. So with these reserves discovered, the pressure from the very top, from the Prime Minister, was let's develop these as efficiently as possible. So a very able CEO was put in place, and the idea was let's just develop them as efficiently and as quickly as possible. So these years from 75 to 85 were perhaps not just the golden years in terms of production, but also in terms of operation and functioning of ONGC. It was also very positive because ONGC obviously drew help from Russians, but then also they drew help from the French, from American companies, and so on. They really brought in all these players and all the technology needed to develop these resources as quickly as possible. So that was a very good development. So just in these 15 years, ONGC's size increased from about 1,000 employees to 50,000 employees. So it really grew quite a bit, and it was not, obviously, much of that manpower went into developing these resources. One other very important factor is that ONGC was also the de facto regulator of the sector, right? And as I said, the regulatory history in India in the energy sector is only 10 years old. So ONGC not only was actually the producer, it was also the regulator. And that is true for also some of the other sectors in India. And that has had important implications, and which came to fore in the 90s when ONGC started to have all sorts of problems. So problems of planning, problems of declining reserves, problems of poor health of the reservoir. So they they developed these reservoirs and they were pumping at a much higher rate. So for the reservoirs, there's optimal rate at which you can draw the resources to increase the lifetime, the amount of resources you can extract over the lifetime of it. And because of demand from the government, because of foreign exchange pressures, ONGC was trying to pump actually quite more than the optimal rate. So there are all sorts of technical issues, all sorts of mismanagement issues that started coming to the fore. And much of this was because ONGC, there was no oversight. It was functioning, it was producing, it was also overseeing itself, which obviously does not go very well. It's a classic mistake in many ways. It's an obvious thing that one should, that the government should have thought about early on, but that did not happen. Also, in terms of the monitoring, all the incentives were ex ante. So there were processes and procedures of how things needed to be done and documented. So long as those processes and procedures are followed, it was all fine, right? There were no performance-based incentives. It was all about, these are the rules, let's follow these rules. Why did India or ONGC come to have this type of system? Why ex-ante rules? To have performance-based incentives, you have to have some metric of comparing performance. This was a monopoly, right? So there was no cost discovery, right? So only, whatever ONGC's costs are, those are the costs. There is nothing to compare with. So in those cases, in sectors that are organized like that, you have to get back to ex-ante rules. It's very hard to monitor through performance-based incentives. It's the cost discovery is hard. Tarun, you have a question?
Why is it so hard? There are benchmarks outside of the country also.
But those are not relevant.
Why?
The geology is different.
Yeah, but you can do adjustments. I can't believe it. There can be no adjustments.
It's, if there is no bench, somebody else has to drill the similar wells or similar distribution of wells. It's very hard to do those adjustments.
But when you say things like there's one of the earlier comments you said there's an optimal depletion rate that presumes some baseline model of optimality.
So that's a discovered reserve. And so you have discovered it, you have characterized it, you have used the best models for which you could presumably use standard models out there to calculate an optimal extraction rate for a discovered resource. Much of the issue here is you drill 100 wells, each of them might cost you several $1 million, $50 million in some cases or above, and most of them are dry. There is no benchmark for that. So somebody else has to come and drill holes which are not all dry to be able to compare with ONGC. And it's very hard unless you are using the same geology.
Yeah, so interestingly, Gujarat State Petroleum Corporation, there's a lot of, it's actually spent, I think 5,000 or 6,000 crores on drilling in the KG Basin. So there's a lot of debate going on within Gujarat's Ministry of, Energy Ministry, about what are the internal benchmarks to which, what's the cost of, they've not managed to actually say that they've got a gas field which they can exploit. So, this is still a sort of, I think, a nascent.
Yeah, and another counterexample is at the KG Basin, where Reliance has had most of its gas discovery from which it is producing. ONGC had held blocks in the same basin for decades, and they had drilled dry holes in very similar geology. And Reliance comes in, and certainly it was probably good project management, but certainly a lot of good luck that they did find substantial gas resources. So it really takes very comparative actions and drilling in the same geology to make those adjustments. Nick?
If
one more example of this, sort of proof by anecdote. I had a friend who worked for Schlumberger, which is an oil field services provider, and they serve government and non-government companies, and he gave examples about why sort of ONGC was wasteful, and among other things said, there are different kinds of drill bits for different surfaces, and you want to change them out as you go deeper because you reach different kinds of underlying geology, and often the ONGC fellows would just say, forget it, plow ahead, and you spoil the drill bit, which is potentially tens of thousands of dollars piece of equipment. Whereas the Reliance or whoever counterpart would not. They would swap it out and do it properly and lower the cost.
Yeah, yeah, and that was, by the time of the late 80s and 90s, that was very systemic. That was quite deep-rooted within ONGC, a lot of which actually started surfacing in terms of operational problems. And that provided, within the context of the economic crisis that happened in India in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of outcry, a lot of pressure in terms of financial reforms. That provided an opening for all sorts of ex-state actors. So here, international lending agencies like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, but also more importantly the private actors, the Reliances of the world, the Enrons of the world, to actually see the opening and actually insert themselves into the policy-making process, but also into this huge sector which was until then closed out to these actors, right?
So you talk about this liberalization in the early 90s. How much was ONGC affected by the withdrawal of subsidies which were given to public corporations at large? So I know that in Coal India, one of the big stories was that huge financial restructuring had to happen within the company because suddenly they had the carpet pulled out from under them and said, break even or else you will be a sick industry. Was ONGC given similar ultimatums in that sense, or were they making enough money that it didn't matter?
I think they were making enough money throughout. So there were issues, especially in the early 90s. There were issues. So government intervention in terms of managing ONGC's revenues were rampant.
Right.
And that had implications of what types of technologies and when and timing of it. That had implications. But it was never a situation of crisis.
Okay.
And to the extent it used to be relevant in the 90s, the last 15 years has been absolutely irrelevant because of all the financial reforms that had happened in the broader economy, but especially in the oil and gas sector.
Kind of a follow-up on that. So since the economy was open and other players started operating, why was ONG able to, continue making or these profits? Did they have the land already?
Right. So yes, absolutely. So they had made these discoveries. So because ONGC was the only operator, there was some science, some geology, some thinking, some technology that went into assessing India's geology, and ONGC had the opportunity to work with all of that for 50 years. So even if somebody is somewhat competent, in this case, they were able to leverage some help from Russia and other companies. They did have some discoveries, some of them actually quite major, both onshore as well as offshore. But in recent times, that's not the case. But their historical production base has been maintained, and just because of the increase in oil prices. So if you're producing 10 units and price goes from 5 to 100, that's being the major difference. So it's not because they have been producing more or because competition has forced them to become more efficient. It's just that they have had this production base which they have somehow managed not to let decline. It has not increased substantially. They have remained profitable, right? So these issues within ONGC and the broader pressures in the economy provided an entry point for the private sector players. And that's kind of the story of the last 10 years or so, which is these major reforms, much of which actually applies to the broader economy, but very substantially to the oil and gas sectors. And at the heart of it is the realization by the government that this is not going to happen, this is not going to work, and we have to separate ONGC's operational and functional activities from the regulatory activities. So with that, so that's one. Second is we do have to increase competition, if not to improve production at least to have better benchmarks to manage ONGC. Third, to improve corporate governance, and so on. So, the World Bank, ADB, so financial crisis was very important. There was not a lot of money to help put into these investments and developments. So these international agencies kind of got India, or had India on a back foot position, where they came in and said, we will bring in a lot of resources if you put these types of reforms in place. And much of that went into changes to corporate governance, increasing competition, price rationalization, and so on and so forth. So that's where I think a key driver in this whole process was India's need for these foreign resources and reserves to actually make investments in developments. But to make that happen, they needed these agencies to actually play along, which kind of enforce these types of disciplines in terms of reform. So that's kind of the origin of how some of this started. Obviously, the international companies, domestic companies, Enron was actually very strong internationally around that time. Some of the early, so as part of this early informal restructuring of ONGC that happened in the mid-90s, chunk of its reserves were auctioned and bought by Reliance. Chunk of them actually went to a group led by Enron. Some of it went to BG. And much of that has changed hands, but a lot of those were actually proven reserves, which are actually taken away from ONGC and given to these private sector folks as part of that rationalization. So let's see how we are doing on time. I still have quite a few slides. So we are at 6:20, and I have.
You have some comments, right? You have some specific comments? No.
But you're not done. Or
I can share just one or two other thoughts, and maybe we can move on to the comment section. Right. So.
I think I thought just to say I have a few comments, but I think that everybody here seems very informed and everything. So I think that the more people have a chance to ask, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll just say that one of the most important changes was this policy here, which came in '99, which is the new exploration and licensing policy, which is basically at everything that we will develop from that policy on, from '99 on, will be on a competitive bidding basis, right? So all the blocks will be given out. They will be carved out. There will be associated data. It will be all transparent. And there is a new regulatory body. There will be competition, arm's length regulation of ONGC, improvements in corporate governance, and so on. And that's NELP. And NELP really, I think, is the right policy framework. It's a question of implementation. It's a question of how well the regulator is functioning, what the existing conflict of interests are, and so on. But NELP really has had very important implications. So let's fast forward to a couple of important things that NELP has actually engendered. So this chart is actually taken from a report by the oil regulator in India. It's the DGH, Directorate General of Hydrocarbons. And what you see on the top there is, so this is the geology in India, potentially oil and gas bearing, potentially hydrocarbon bearing that was unexplored. Half of it was unexplored in '95. And especially after the policy was actually put in place, you see that much of what was in the red sector, which is unexplored, is actually now explored. So this is some measure that there is more exploration and production activity. Right? A lot of it is being done by ONGC, about half, but other half is being done by the Reliances, by the BGs, by the BPs, and other private players. So there has been increased competition. There are a range of actors that are active. Early on, though, ONGC was still able to get hold of a lot of these acreages because it had much of the data, it had a lot of the knowledge of the system, so it was able to bid smartly or overbid in many cases to get back a lot of this acreage. But nonetheless, it did have to compete. A very interesting offshoot of all of this is Reliance also bid very aggressively early on and actually acquired a lot of these acreages. And its KG basin, I think, was from one of these two NELP rounds. So these are different rounds of acreage biddings that have happened. So this shows 6, but there have been 9 rounds so far. But the overall message here is that it has largely, for the first few rounds, led to this duopoly between ONGC and Reliance. But at the same time, it has forced, the competition that has emerged has forced ONGC to shape up in many ways, some of which are actually forming joint ventures with international companies and starting to use international standards and to benchmark its technological performance. So it had competition-related implications for how much geology is actually being explored, but then also implications for the performance of ONGC itself. Let me just make this one remark, and then I can show some of the other slides if there are relevant questions on those slides. But this point is on the technological capacity. So while all of this happening, what happened to the innovative capability, or even to the capability to make use of new technologies from outside? And that has been really a very sorry story in India. So what you see on the chart here on the left is ONGC's investments in R&D, and that's hovered around quarter of, so 0.25 percent points of its revenues. For international oil companies, that number is between 3 to 6%. It's much higher. And if you drill down within that number, so there is some expenditure, but if you drill down what happens to that number, it's really not well tied to its commercial operations. So this is money that is doled out to different institutions which have their own life, which do not directly relate to the business that ONGC is trying to do. And this is a broader malady of the broader innovation system in India, actually. So what you see on the right there is just one indicator of the broader innovation system. It is not a perfect metric, but patents filed per resident, and you see India is very flat as compared to China. Obviously, patent is just one and very impartial and not a very accurate measure, but nonetheless, you see that structurally it's very different from some of the other economies, and that's been a consistent failure. My main observation there is that in the political economy and evolving regulatory context of India, firms find it very risky to base their business strategy that focuses on R&D, because the broader national innovation system is not there, which I believe much larger parts of which are actually public good. So university system, higher education and training. So this has to be a given as a public good on which then firms can build up. That's basically not there in ways in which firms can make a good use of it. So that's been, in all of this much, I think this troubles me perhaps the most. And there are other questions, other data on the subsidies and profits of the other companies, but we can get to that in the Q&A. Thank you.
I'll just take a couple of minutes. Okay. I thought it was very interesting. I wish we had 2 hours. I think like you had materials for 2 or 3 hours. But just 3 things that... I
thought I'll speak only for 30 minutes.
Well, you did have questions. So just 3 general areas where you motivated me to want to know more or to think about more. And one is in this, the story of what seems to be happening, or my understanding of what seems to be happening in India, which is that some reforms have been made, unlike in countries like Mexico, right? So how... Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering if maybe later you have some thoughts about whether the difference is that in Mexico is such a big thing, such a big part of their budget. I think 40% of the total budget was this, and there's also a lot of public opposition to giving away their oil. So there's this national sentiment that makes it very difficult. Even though Peña Nieto, the current president, has, it was one of his key priorities, and he seems to be having a lot of trouble to reform the operations of their national oil company. And then in contrast, so that's one contrast with one of the other big and emerging economies. The other contrast is, of course, China, right? on the technological capacity front, and at least in the wind industry case, which is one that I know the most about, they had a lot of incentives, not just the local manufacturing requirements, but also tax incentives for joint ventures. So they were actively trying to encourage domestic firms to learn the technology, in ways that go beyond the possibly non-WTO compliant manufacturing requirements. So it just, I thought that you put it in a nice way, and to see, hey, there's a lot of big changes on progress in some areas, but then in other areas they're falling behind. So what may be able to learn from other countries for the plus or the bad? I was curious about the conversation you started to have about the subsidies. And we've had recently the IEA reports on the size of fossil fuel subsidies, and Obama said we need to get rid of subsidies. And I was actually curious about, and I know kerosene subsidy is a very big one in India. So what are your thoughts about whether those can be reformed? And I was kind of, Joel at the Kennedy School has been thinking about what the impact of subsidies can be on some negative implications. So I was interested on the future of subsidies, again, from the political economy of it. And finally, one point that maybe you were going to touch on if we had gotten to electricity was the decentralized versus centralized electricity systems. And there's been a lot of push from international actors, the donors, to try to promote decentralized solar photovoltaics and things like this. And obviously, you have questions of time versus speed of the grid. And I just didn't know if you had any thoughts about where China is on that front. And I'll stop there because I have heard very great comments from people.
Sure. So, on your first two questions, the first question was about how do we contrast with the case of Mexico. The second question was on the technological capacity
India
and how it contrasts with China. Then the last question, and I have to think back on the third question. Last question was, the third one was on subsidies, and the last one was on the electricity sector, centralized versus decentralized. For the first two questions on technological capacity and contrast with Mexico, I think if you look at what India's position is in that sector, which is it's basically a consumer country. It's not a producer country, as against Mexico, which is a producer country. So in our 15-country case studies, as I said, I think only 2 of the countries that we looked at were consumer countries, China and India. And there the entire dynamic is different. So if you are a producer country, then other factors of resource nationalism come into play, of expectations of broader public goods come into play, not just in terms of price breaks or subsidies, direct subsidies, but also in terms of public institutions or other hospitals and roads and so on and so forth. Some of which is relevant to Mexico, but it's perhaps even more relevant to Venezuela, a lot more relevant to Abu Dhabi and countries like Kuwait and so on. But I think the key difference in the case of India is that it is a demand-led country. So the focus, and it also relates to your question on technological capacity, the focus has not been on developing the technological capacity. So rather, the government's focus throughout has been on production, right? Whatever it takes for you to produce, to the extent that even if it takes for you to break the reservoir, produce more. And that's exactly what happened in the late 80s. The unfortunate thing was there was no regulator to actually oversee ONGC and say, don't do that, even if the government wants to do it. So part of all this actually has to, it really goes to the heart of interaction of ONGC with the government, and the government really sending consistent messages that produce, and do it whichever way you want to do it. ONGC, because it got caught between its fame and the golden years and then the troubles, it really neither it had to as part of its mandate or as part of its planning or its proactive thinking. Technological capacity development was not essential, right? I see it more as a question of missed opportunity rather than what was required of ONGC. So in many ways, ONGC was, in every way actually, ONGC was the agent of the government, and then an agent that also ended up having a life of its own. Technological capacity was not a piece of that story, basically. So I think for the first two questions, it's really the main contrast, the main difference is really that India has always been demand-led country with huge foreign exchange issues. And that has, for understanding everything, that is always a central piece. On your question of the contrast with, on the question of subsidies, so I think this is the slide that actually goes into the question that was raised earlier on what is the profitability of some of the other companies compared to ONGC. So let's go back to this slide, which is really a slide from 2007, but you can put even 2013 numbers on it. So it shows gasoline prices in cents per liter. If you want dollars per gallon, just multiply it by 3.5 and divide by 100. That should be very easy. But US was here in 2007 and still there in 2013, so roughly $3 to $4 a gallon. India was at about $4.5 to $5 per gallon in 2007, and right now it is somewhere between $5 to $6 per gallon. So my basic message here is the price of petroleum products is very high in India. That is after subsidies, right? And I'll come back and explain what these subsidies are. So how can you have subsidies and still have a $6 gallon per price? So, right? One of the things when I started looking at this sector, I solved this puzzle first it troubled me at night. So I really tried to understand this first. So what happens here?
This is petrol.
This is gasoline. Yes, petrol. This is petrol. Yes. So what happens is 50% of these prices are actually taxes. Taxes by the central government, taxes by the state government, in some cases local governments, so metropolitan cities, they also have their own taxes. So 50% of the price is actually tax. So where is the subsidy? Well, if the subsidy was not there, then the tax would have been 70%. Right? So it's basically the tax rates are so high that if you live with those tax rates, you would end up with a price of $7 per gallon. And then at that point, the government comes in and says, well, that's too high. Let's take off $1. So let's let the price be $6 per gallon. So that's the $1 difference. And these are not accurate numbers, but representative of the financial engineering that is happening. Right? So tax rates are very high, and then at the margins, some of it is actually given back as subsidies. Why is the tax rate so high? Well, India's tax, shadow economy in India is very large. Tax base is not well developed. It's a work in progress. And historically, this has been an easy route, especially the last 15 years with oil prices increasing, has been an easy route for the government to actually get revenues. Right? So one of the more important pieces that remain to be solved to really rationalize the oil and gas sector in India is if you could develop your tax base. I mean, that is the holy grail answer to almost a lot of the problems, right? But certainly for oil and gas, you can imagine if that happens, you can very quickly take off 20–30% taxes. So all the political opposition that you're seeing right now will basically evaporate. So that's part of the answer. The second piece is to your question of how much of the subsidies are going to kerosene versus diesel. So these are numbers from early 2000s. But basically what you see is, so these are subsidies for the different factors over different years. These are total subsidies. And here you see the distribution of those subsidies, all right, by percentages. And what you see is so diesel is the bottommost column. And over time, kerosene subsidies are actually decreasing, and that's the same thing for LPG. There has been some rationalization where there has been somewhat better targeting. There are caps that have been put in place, especially for LPG. So basically, families cannot get any number of cylinders or any amount of kerosene. So if you cap it at, let's say, 5 cylinders a year, if your basic motive is to target lower income, that still holds, but folks who are higher income basically now have to get more, presumably because they're using more, right? So there have been significant changes in targeting, but the big story really has been in the growth in diesel consumption, and diesel prices are actually still subsidized in many ways. So we know it doesn't take too much of a difference to produce petrol or gasoline, give or take the differences in emission prices, right? But in India, diesel prices are much, much lower than petrol. So that's being a killer. And that's what you see actually towards the end. If you actually carry this forward, you see that growing even more. So recently, diesel prices have also being started to get increased a little bit more. But I think the problem has kind of shifted now from kerosene being a big issue, which still is a big issue, really with the consumption growing in the transportation sector and so on. Diesel has come to a big focus. And that's a whole different interest group compared to the interest group for kerosene, which are the lower income or lower middle income folks, where you can still do some targeting for. But for diesel, it's become more of an issue. Right?
So more of a governance question, but do you see IPOs and going public as a viable, first of all, financial strategy for a lot of these companies, but also a way of bringing in more efficiency and innovation to these companies?
So what as a way of?
IPOs are going public. So disinvesting these companies, which are still majority owned by the government, but because of fiscal deficit problems and all, disinvestment in a lot of these companies is being considered right now. But do you think that will have R&D implications as well, or is it just a way for the government to raise money without really focusing on kind of governance and downstream concerns?
Yeah, I think in the current scenario of a lot of financial engineering that is going on, right? Let me complete the story of financial engineering specifically to address this question. So for crude producers like ONGC, folks who actually produce the oil, price is rationalized. So you produce 1 barrel, and no matter who you sell it to any refiner, you get $100 per barrel. You get the market price. Give or take freight charges. So that's rationalized. For the refiners, they are paying folks like ONGC the full price of oil, but to the customers, they are capped. They cannot take away all the prices. So that's where they're not making. So they're paying all the money, but they're not able to sell at those prices. So they're left with a gap. And that's known as under-recovery in India. For these companies, that's known as under-recovery of revenues. And the government fills those under-recoveries through all sorts of bonds, ad hoc bonds, year on year. And the main effort on the government's part is to keep those debts off the government's books and actually push it to these companies. So it has actually become a financial burden for a lot of these companies. It's very hard to raise money. But within this context of very complex subsidies, and I always say subsidies in the context of India in oil and gas as in double quotes. I really don't think these are subsidies in the conventional sense. R&D is just it's completely lost, right? For the refiners, actually, some of them they originated from international operations, so they were much more efficient, and their organizational culture or their corporate culture was actually much better than ONGC to begin with, which actually emerged from a conventional ministry and the administrative branches in India. So the refiners actually, internally, they're much better organized than ONGC, but R&D innovation is completely not a big part of this picture. Your question of decentralized versus centralized, it's actually very relevant, which is even in that case, so there is a very aggressive solar policy in India, and the underlying mandates are actually conflicting, which is, so to have investments, so there is a requirement for rapid deployment, and to make that happen, you have to deploy known technologies with known performances. So we are talking about standard technologies, and for indigenous companies to actually compete in standard technologies is almost impossible, right? Because just in the last 5 years, China came into the market and has taken everybody away by surprise. In 2005, China was producing 0%, and now it produces 70% of global sales. How do companies in India compete with that, starting with no base, but no way to match the scale of coordination that China. So you can imagine that given the scale of demand that India can generate, you would expect it to be at some level somewhere in the ballpark of China. But it goes beyond. My reading there is that it really has to do with policy coordination. where India has flatly failed. A very key difference also in the electricity sector is about a lot of the distribution companies are actually running in losses. So the electricity distribution companies are companies that sell the electricity, right? And electricity rates are capped. So they're not, even the electricity companies are not making the money, but they have to be, those debts have to be paid off. And to pay those debts off, these electric companies take loans from the banks. Now banks can only be invested in a certain sector, can only expose themselves to a certain level. And all the banks are exposed to their brim because they're trying to help these companies service their debts, right? So there is no financial ability within the lending institutions in India to be able to invest in renewable technologies, even if there is demand, because that increases. It's the same sector. At the end of the day, you have to be able to recover revenues from the same discoms, right? So even in the case of India, even after you have created this demand, the lending ability is not there to actually carry that demand forward. And that opens the space up for agencies like Export-Import Bank of the US, OPIC in the US, where a lot of investments are being channeled to India with purchases made from US firms and so on. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic, but goes back to the fundamental limits, debt limits that the financial institutions in India have.
This whole question of how does one reform the system? I don't know much about the sector other than being an outside observer, but when you compare across other natural resources, you have Pemex comparison, Petrobras, PDVSA, and even other sectors like Vale and Brazil, the amount of fights that they have between Lula and the fellow who used to run Vale, and how that played out. It's actually quite instructive because there are a lot of ways to, as you were alluding to, the partial privatization has made it very difficult for the government to keep grabbing. Even in the Vale case, even though Lula was able to force out the CEO of the biggest company, ultimately the president of Brazil did not have the ability to get his way into the company. So there was enough electoral and democratic and market-based pressure that pushed back. I think that whole tension is super interesting between the politics and society pushing back. But I feel that there's a lot to learn from comparing across both intra-country and like you guys were trying to do in that book of yours, which I remember. So it's really interesting.
And I should mention that Tarun actually, I don't know if Tarun remembers it, but he provided detailed comments on an earlier draft of that chapter. Do you remember that, Tarun? He doesn't.
All right, so we're sort of out of time, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.